Hey there, Grasshoppers, Mr. Raymond here, and today we're talking about all the things that made the 1850s so interesting. Oh, come on, the 1850s. It's that decade before the Civil War, that decade that nobody knows anything about, that decade that if you ask your principal, ask your math teacher, ask your parents, ask your next door neighbor if they know anything about, they can't name anything. They don't know any of the four that were president of the United States during the 1850s. They can't tell you about any of the technological advances, or the compromises, or the events that happened in the 1850s. It's just that blank slate on everybody's mind as far as history class goes. I mean, heck, even the people that lived in the 1850s didn't look excited to be living in the 1850s. Have you ever seen a picture of somebody that was alive back then who looked stoked to be alive in the 1850s? It's almost impossible. So does this make the 1850s boring? Heck no. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to talk about the top 10 things that made the 1850s one of the most interesting things that you heard about today. Number 10, we're starting with the great compromiser, Henry Clay. That's right, Henry Clay is still in our story. When we first met Henry Clay way back when we introduced the War of 1812, he was a young war hawk from Kentucky who wanted to go to war with Great Britain. Yeah, through the course of his lifetime, he may have been the Buffalo Bills of presidential candidates, but you cannot take away the fact they had a lasting impact on our nation's history. Henry Clay didn't get the nickname the Great Compromiser for no reason. It was he who made compromises between the different sections of our country throughout the course of his time in our Congress that helped keep our country together. Ironically, his final compromise may have greatly contributed to the ultimate fracturing of our country. Number 9, choo-choo trains. That's right, we're going to talk railroads here for a second. Before the 1850s, there were tracks here, there were tracks there. It was a very regional thing. But by the 1850s, these tracks became more united, more of a fluid interstate system that reached as far south as Texas, as far west as the Mississippi River. By the 1850s, there was almost 10,000 miles of active railroad track in our nation, and this number triples by the year 1860 to almost 30,000. Number 8, a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin was written by Harriet and published in 1852. The book sold over 300,000 copies in its first year of publication, was translated into over a dozen languages, and was sold worldwide. This book really hammered home the evils of slavery to people in the North, and it did anger people in the South. It gave the voices of abolition a new audience and drove an even deeper rift between the Northern abolitionists and the Southerners who wanted to maintain their way of life in the institution of slavery. And number 7, cherries and milk. That's right, cherries and milk, ladies and gentlemen. I mentioned the 4 presidents in the 1850s. That means that something unfortunate must have happened to one of them, and that is Mr. Zachary Taylor. Old Rough and Ready may have helped win the Mexican War, but he had a hard time surviving the 4th of July in 1850. After presiding over a 4th of July ceremony in Washington, D.C., and suffering from heat exhaustion, he went back to the White House and requested his favorite meal, a bowl of raw vegetables, fruits, and iced buttered milk. Most of these things were probably produced in the farm fields outside of Washington, D.C., which in 1850 was pretty much an open sewer. Taylor became ill after eating the meal, and 5 days later, he passed away from cholera, becoming the second president to die while in office. Number 6, whales, the largest mammal to live on the planet Earth. In the 1850s, the whaling industry was well ahead of its time and far more equal opportunity employment than any other business in the United States of America. Most of the whale ships were owned by Quakers, and most of the ports where the whale ships sailed into in New England were stops on the Underground Railroad. Therefore, a lot of escaped slaves and free African Americans found employment on whaling ships. Nobody really cared what color your skin was. If you were willing to go up against the largest mammal on the face of the earth with nothing but a harpoon, then the whaling industry wanted you. Number 5, the Republican Party. The Grand Old Party, the Republican Party, was born in the 1850s. With the rise of abolitionists in the 1850s, there were a lot of political parties that supported abolition and the end of slavery, including the Free Soil Party, the American Party, or the Know Nothing Party. the Northern Whigs. Eventually, by 1854, these smaller political parties coalesced into the modern-day Republican Party, which stood firmly against the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. In 1856, they proved that they were going to be a force to be reckoned with, and by 1860, Abraham Lincoln became the first Republican to win the presidency. To this day, no political party has won more presidential elections than the Republican Party. They've won 24. Number 4, insane violence. There was no declared war in 1850, but when pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers all rushed into Kansas to try to influence a new government, things just got really, really out of control. What became known as Bleeding Kansas. Dozens of people were killed. Abolitionist John Brown hacked up a family of pro-slavery settlers with broadswords. This was just absolutely crazy. And the violence wasn't just in Kansas. It spilled over to the United States Congress when Representative Preston Brooks decided to beat Senator Charles Sumner over the head with a cane, nearly killing him after Sumner delivered a fiery speech denouncing the institution of slavery. Number 3, the United States Supreme Court. In the 1850s, they made hands down the worst decision that the United States Supreme Court ever made in the ruling of Dred Scott versus Sanford. In this Supreme Court case, Dred Scott, a slave, sued for his freedom. And in the ruling in 1857, Roger Taney wrote that not only did Dred Scott not have the right to sue because he wasn't a citizen, but the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution protected the right to property. And in this case, a Southerner's right to own slaves, therefore stating in the Supreme Court ruling that slaves weren't people, they were property. Outrageous. Number 2, Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, 2 people who fought the good fight with both words and deeds. Frederick Douglass was born into slavery, knew what it was like to be a slave, knew what it was like to escape and fail, to escape to the North and succeed, and to live on the run as a free black man. Frederick Douglass becomes one of the most influential intellects of the 1800s and becomes one of the most outspoken lecturers about the institution of slavery. As far as Harriet Tubman goes, she was born into slavery and escaped into the North in 1849. Harriet Tubman is going to risk her life over 19 times to go back into the South to help other slaves escape on the Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman was most proud that she never ran her train off the track and that she never lost a passenger. And finally, number 1, the number 1 reason why the 1850s are so interesting, 3 blind mice. We're going to call them Fillmore, Pierce, and Buchanan, our 13th, 14th, and 15th president. And why are these guys usually considered by historians to be the Polish sausage of the American presidents, the worst? It's because every opportunity that they had in the 1850s to head off, to stop, to change the course of our country before it divulged into civil war, they essentially punted the football to the next guy. They were, hands down, the worst. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, the top 10 reasons why the 1850s were so interesting. Before I go, I just want to remind you all that in these times that we're living in, please just try to embrace the pace and remember, you're not stuck at home, you're safe at home.